The static from my broken comm still rang in my ears, blending with the deafening applause of the auditorium. As the President of the United States pinned the silver star to my dress uniform, I didn't look at him. I stared straight into the glowing red light of the live broadcast camera. I knew exactly who was sitting in a worn-out recliner in Boston, watching his television in stunned silence. The man who swore on my mother's grave that I would break. The kitchen smelled the way it always did on a Sunday morning. Stale black coffee, wet dog, and the cheap cigar smoke my father, Edmund Gallagher, thought made him look like a mob boss instead of a retired hardware store manager. I was 21 years old, standing in the center of the linoleum floor, clutching a manila folder so tightly, my knuckles were white. "Put the kettle on, Cassidy," he grunted without looking up from the sports section of the Boston Globe. He was a massive man, a third-generation Army infantryman whose career was cut short by a blown-out knee and an insubordinate mouth. He spent his life glorifying the military, worshipping at the altar of combat, and making sure everyone in our house knew that true grit was a strictly male trait. I didn't move toward the stove. Instead, I walked to the table and dropped the folder right on top of the box scores. The heavy thud made his coffee cup rattle. He slowly lowered the paper, his gray eyes narrowing. "What's this?" "My enlistment papers," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, though I had practiced screaming it in my car for an hour. "I ship out for Fort Leonard Wood in 3 weeks. Combat engineer." For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the house was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then, Edmund laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was a harsh, scraping bark that felt like sandpaper against my spine. "Combat engineer?" he wheezed, tossing the folder back at me. It slid off the table and hit the floor, spilling the meticulously signed documents across the linoleum. "Cassidy, you cry when a stray cat looks at you wrong. You can't even carry the 50-pound bags of concrete mix at the store without whining about your back. You think you're going to clear minefields? You think you're going to carry an 80-pound ruck through the mud? I've been training." "You've been playing pretend," he snapped, his amusement vanishing, replaced by a cold, cutting disdain. He stood up, towering over my 5'4" frame. "The military doesn't need porcelain dolls trying to prove a point. They need soldiers. You'll wash out in a week. You'll ring the bell, cry to the drill sergeant, and embarrass the Gallagher name. Don't do this. Save us both the humiliation." He walked past me, intentionally bumping my shoulder with his, and left the room. I didn't cry. I knelt down, gathered my papers, and swore to myself that I would die in a trench before I ever let that man see me fail. 3 weeks later, I stepped off a bus in Missouri into a torrential downpour, entirely unprepared for the absolute hell that awaited me. Basic combat training was a nightmare, but not for the reasons Edmund thought it would be. I didn't cry when Drill Sergeant Hayes, a man whose vocal cords seemed to be made of pure gravel and malice, screamed in my face until his spit coated my safety glasses. I didn't break down when my hands blistered and bled from digging fighting positions in the rocky Ozark soil. The real nightmare was the sheer physical disadvantage. I was surrounded by farm boys from Iowa and defensive linemen from Texas. When we did the confidence course, I had to throw my entire body weight into obstacles they simply stepped over. By week 4, I was running on 3 hours of sleep, nursing a shin splint that felt like shattered glass, and trying to choke down an MRE in the pouring rain. A recruit named Dawson sat next to me in the mud, shivering violently. "I'm done, Gallagher," Dawson whispered, staring at his trembling hands. "I'm going to medical tomorrow. I'm taking a discharge. This ain't worth it." I looked at him, my muscles screaming in agony, every fiber of my being wanting to agree with him. I wanted a warm bed. I wanted to stop hurting. But then, floating in the dark periphery of my exhausted mind, I saw Edmund's smug, cynical smile. "You'll embarrass the family name." "No, you're not," I spat, surprising myself with the venom in my own voice. I grabbed Dawson by the collar of his wet uniform. "You are not quitting. You put your head down, you eat your cold food, and you take the pain. Because if you quit, they win. And they don't get to win." Drill Sergeant Hayes had been walking the perimeter. He stopped behind me, the rain drumming against his wide-brimmed hat. He looked down at me, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "Gallagher?" Hayes barked. "Yes, Drill Sergeant." I snapped to attention, my legs trembling. You're either the stupidest recruit in this company or the most stubborn. Which is it? Both, drill sergeant. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch pulled at the corner of Hayes's mouth. Finish your chow. We've got a 12-mile ruck in 10 minutes. And Gallagher? Yes, drill sergeant. You're carrying the M240 machine gun today. Let's see if your spine is as strong as your mouth. I carried the weapon. It dug into my shoulder, grinding against my collarbone until I was sure I was bleeding through my uniform. My lungs burned, my vision tunneled, but I kept my eyes fixed on the boots of the soldier in front of me, putting one foot in front of the other. Step, step, don't break. Step, step. Defy him. I graduated near the top of my class. On Family Day, the parade field was filled with crying mothers, proud fathers, and screaming siblings. I stood at parade rest, scanning the bleachers. Edmund didn't come. When I finally got my phone back, there was a single text message from him. Basic is a joke nowadays. Let's see how long the real army tolerates you. Don't get anyone killed. I locked my screen, shoved the phone into my duffel bag, and boarded the transport to my first duty station. The porcelain hadn't cracked. It had been fired in the kiln. Now, it was time to become steel. 2 years later, the Syrian desert. The locals called the valley Maham al-Shaitan, the Devil's Anvil. It was a sun-blasted stretch of rock, sand, and ruined concrete where the heat regularly breached 115 degrees. I was a corporal now, a certified combat engineer attached to a mechanized infantry platoon. Our job was route clearance. We drove heavy, armored vehicles ahead of supply convoys, looking for the things that wanted to blow our infantry to pieces. It was a grueling, terrifying, and profoundly tedious job. Hours of staring at dirt, looking for wires, disturbed soil, or anything that didn't belong. My squad was a tight-knit machine. There was Staff Sergeant Wyatt, a calm, analytical leader who treated us like his kids. Specialist Mitchell, a kid from Chicago who used dark humor to cope with the anxiety of the job. And PFC O'Connor, our fresh-faced driver who looked like he belonged in a high school marching band, not a combat zone. It was August 14th, a Tuesday. We were clearing a narrow mountain pass known to be a rat line for insurgents smuggling weapons. I was up in the turret of the MRAP, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle, my hands resting on the grips of the .50 caliber machine gun. The heat radiating from the metal was blistering, even through my tactical gloves. "Hey, Gallagher!" Mitchell's voice crackled through the headset. "If we hit a mine today and I lose my legs, you gotta promise to delete my internet search history before you call my mom." "If we hit a mine, Mitchell, your search history is going to be the least of your problems," I replied, scanning the ridgeline through my optics. "Keep your eyes on the shoulder. Dirt looks loose near that burned-out sedan." "Copy that, Mom," Mitchell teased. We crept forward at 5 miles per hour. The silence in the valley was oppressive. No birds, no wind, just the low, guttural hum of our diesel engine. Then, the world shattered. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical force, a tidal wave of pressure that punched the air out of my lungs and violently threw me against the steel ring of the turret. A blinding flash of orange light erupted from beneath the lead vehicle of our convoy. 50 yards ahead, an IED, a massive one. Before the dust had even settled, the sharp, chaotic cracking of AK-47 fire rained down on us from the rocky cliffs above. It was a complex ambush. Hit the lead vehicle, trap the convoy, and rain hell on the sitting ducks. Contact left, I screamed, ripping the charging handle of the .50 calories back and depressing the butterfly trigger. The heavy machine gun roared to life, violently shaking my entire body as I sent fist-sized rounds chewing into the rocks where the muzzle flashes were sparking. Down in the cabin, chaos reigned. "Wyatt's hit!" O'Connor screamed over the radio. "Shrapnel came through the floor panel. He's bleeding out, Cass. I don't know what to do." "Get the medic up here!" I yelled into the comms, but all I got back was a high-pitched squeal. The blast had scrambled our primary radio frequencies. We were cut off from the rear element. I ducked as a burst of enemy fire pinged off the armored shield of my turret. I looked toward the lead vehicle. It was a smoking, twisted ruin of metal. Through the thick, black smoke, I saw a figure dragging themselves out of the passenger side door, collapsing into the dirt. It was Mitchell. He was fully exposed in the kill zone. The insurgents on the ridge immediately shifted their fire toward him, the dirt kicking up in small geysers all around his body. A voice finally broke through my secondary earpiece. It was Lieutenant Davis, commanding the rear guard, 3 vehicles back. All elements, this is actual. Do not dismount. I repeat, do not dismount. Maintain your armor. We are calling in air support. Maintain armor. Stay inside. Let the man in the dirt die. Don't get anyone killed. My father's final text message flashed in my brain like a neon sign. O'Connor! I screamed, dropping down from the turret into the smoke-filled cabin. Wyatt was slumped in his seat, unconscious, a massive laceration across his thigh. Keep pressure on Wyatt's leg. Do not let up. Where are you going? O'Connor panicked, his eyes wide with terror. I'm getting Mitchell, the LT said. Stay in the truck, Gallagher. Screw the LT. I grabbed my M4 rifle, slapped a fresh magazine into the well, and kicked open the heavy rear door of the MRAP. The heat and noise hit me like a physical wall. The air was thick with cordite and pulverized concrete. Bullets snapped past my head like angry hornets. I didn't think about the porcelain doll. I didn't think about my father's sneer. I just moved. I sprinted toward the burning vehicle, dropping to a slide behind a small concrete barrier just as a barrage of bullets chewed the ground where I had been standing a millisecond before. Mitchell was 10 feet away, clutching his shoulder, his face pale and covered in soot. Cass! He choked out, coughing blood. My legs! I can't feel my legs! I got you! I yelled, pulling a smoke grenade from my webbing. I ripped the pin out with my teeth, spat it into the dirt, and hurled the canister between us and the ridge. Thick white smoke instantly billowed out, creating a temporary, blinding wall. I broke cover and dove into the smoke, grabbing the drag handle on the back of Mitchell's plate carrier. He screamed in agony as I pulled him. He was dead weight, over 200 pounds of gear and muscle. My back screamed, my arms burned, but I dug my boots into the sand and pulled with everything I had. You can't even carry the concrete bags at the store. Shut up, Edmund, I hissed under my breath. Shut up, shut up, shut up. I dragged Mitchell behind the husk of the destroyed vehicle. I immediately went to work. Training took over. Muscle memory replaced fear. I slapped a tourniquet high and tight on his shattered left leg, cranking the windlass until the bleeding stopped. I packed his shoulder wound with combat gauze, my hands slick with his blood. Suddenly, a massive concussive force lifted me entirely off the ground. An RPG had impacted the other side of our cover. I slammed into the dirt, the world spinning in violent, sickening circles. A high-pitched ringing drowned out the gunfire. I looked down at my left arm. A piece of jagged shrapnel the size of a razor blade was embedded deep in my bicep. I couldn't feel it. Adrenaline was a hell of a drug. I blinked the dirt out of my eyes and saw the silhouettes of insurgents moving down the ridge through the smoke. They were flanking us. I propped Mitchell against the tire. Hold this, I said, putting his hand on his own tourniquet. I grabbed my rifle, rested the barrel over the hood of the ruined truck, and took a breath. I didn't spray and pray. I aimed. 1 shot, 1 kill. I dropped the first insurgent, shifted, dropped the second. The others scrambled back up the rocks, realizing the sitting ducks had teeth. For 45 agonizing minutes, I held that position. I bandaged Mitchell, I returned fire, and I used a handheld radio stripped from the destroyed truck to finally raise the quick reaction force. I fed them our grid coordinates with a voice so steady and calm it felt like it belonged to someone else. When the Black Hawk helicopters finally roared over the horizon, raining Hellfire missiles onto the ridge and dropping medics into the dust, I finally let myself collapse against the tire next to Mitchell. A medic grabbed me, looking at the blood soaking my sleeve. "Corporal, you're hit. Let me see that arm." "I'm fine," I gasped, pointing to Mitchell. Take him first." As they loaded us onto the bird, the adrenaline finally cracked. The pain in my arm flared into a blinding white agony, and the sheer terror of what had just happened crashed over me like a wave. I lay on the aluminum floor of the helicopter, staring up at the spinning rotors, covered in my own blood and the blood of my squad mate. I was alive. Mitchell was alive. As the chopper banked toward the medical base, I closed my eyes and allowed myself exactly one thought of the man in Boston. I didn't break. I woke up to the blinding fluorescent lights of Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, before being swiftly transferred to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Maryland. The transition from the dust of the Syrian desert to the sterile, ammonia-scented corridors of a hospital ward was jarring. One minute I was suffocating in cordite and sand. The next, I was listening to the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. The shrapnel had shredded my left bicep, narrowly missing the brachial artery. The surgeons had to graft muscle and skin to save the arm. The pain was a living, breathing entity that sat on my chest every time the morphine wore off. But the physical agony was nothing compared to the phantom adrenaline that still kept me awake at night, my hands involuntarily gripping the bedsheets like I was still pulling Mitchell through the dirt. Mitchell was in the ward 2 floors down. He lost his left leg just below the knee. I visited him in a wheelchair the first week, both of us bandaged, bruised, and heavily medicated. We didn't talk about the firefight. We talked about baseball. We talked about how terrible the hospital jello was. We talked about everything except the devil's anvil, because if we spoke its name, the memories would flood the room and drown us both. During my second month of rehab, the military command officially launched a review of the ambush. Statements were taken. Body camera footage from the Quick Reaction Force was analyzed. And then, the whispers started. "They're putting you in for the Silver Star, Gallagher," Staff Sergeant Wyatt told me one afternoon. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his legs still wrapped in thick gauze, but he had made the trip to Maryland just to see me. The LT signed off on it. The battalion commander signed off on it. It's going all the way to the top. I stared at my lap, tracing the angry red scars on my arm. "I was just doing my job, Sergeant. You disobeyed a direct order to stay in your vehicle, ran into a kill zone, dragged a 200-pound man 30 yards under heavy machine gun fire, and held off a flanking maneuver single-handedly," Wyatt said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just do your job, Cassidy. You saved our lives. Own it." The news of the nomination eventually leaked to the civilian press. The narrative was irresistible to the media. A young female combat engineer from Boston pulling her squad mate from a burning wreck. The Boston Globe ran a front-page feature. I waited for the phone to ring. I waited for the gruff, raspy voice of Edmund Gallagher to come through the receiver, telling me that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't made of porcelain after all. The phone never rang. Instead, a week later, I received a visitor. It wasn't my father. It was Thomas Sullivan, a retired master sergeant and my father's oldest friend. Sullivan was the only man my father respected, a gruff infantry veteran who used to drink cheap beer on our porch and tell war stories. Sullivan walked into my hospital room, took off his faded veteran ball cap, and sat in the plastic chair next to my bed. He looked old, tired, and deeply uncomfortable. "He's not going to call, kid," Sullivan said quietly, skipping the pleasantries. I looked away, staring out the window at the gray Maryland sky. I didn't expect him to. "Yes, you did. And you deserve a call. You deserve a goddamn parade," Sullivan sighed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "But you need to understand something about Edmund. Something he'd kill me for telling you." I turned my head back to him, my brow furrowing. "Understand what?" "Edmund talks a big game about grit, about blood and guts and the glory of the infantry," Sullivan said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "He gave you hell for enlisting because he said you were too soft. But that wasn't about you, Cassidy. It was never about you." Sullivan rubbed his face, looking suddenly ashamed. "Back in '91, during Desert Storm, Edmund and I were in the same platoon. We took incoming fire, heavy artillery and small arms. It was our first real taste of combat." Sullivan paused, his eyes glazing over as he looked at the linoleum floor. Edmund broke. The man completely froze. He dropped his weapon in the trench and curled into a ball, screaming. When the sergeant ordered us to move up, Edmund panicked. He scrambled backward, trying to get away, slipped down the embankment, and shattered his own knee on a concrete barrier. That's how he got his injury. Not from enemy fire. Not from charging a bunker. He blew his knee out running away. The room went dead silent. The beeping of my heart monitor seemed to echo off the walls. I felt the air leave my lungs. The army gave him a medical discharge, Sullivan continued. We all kept our mouths shut to spare him the shame, but it ate him alive. He spent the rest of his life overcompensating, projecting this hyper-masculine, fearless warrior persona to hide the fact that when the bullets started flying, he was a coward. I felt a hot tear slide down my cheek, but it wasn't out of sadness. It was a violent, earth-shattering realization. All those years, all the verbal abuse, the relentless belittling in the kitchen, the smirk when I left for basic training. He saw you join up, Sullivan said softly, and he was terrified. Not that you would get hurt, he was terrified that you would be braver than he was. And Cassidy, you were. 6 months later, the East Room of the White House. The chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the polished hardwood floors. The room was packed with generals, politicians, and reporters. I stood at rigid attention, wearing my dress blue uniform. The brass buttons gleamed, the fabric crisp, the scars beneath it hidden from the world. My left arm still ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, but I stood perfectly still. Mitchell was sitting in the front row, his prosthetic leg resting proudly on the floor. Wyatt was next to him, beaming with a pride that made my chest tight. Corporal Cassidy Gallagher, the military aide's voice boomed through the speakers, reading the official citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy, while serving as a combat engineer. As the aide read the details of the ambush in the Devil's Anvil, the room fell into a heavy, reverent silence. I didn't focus on the words. I looked straight ahead, past the rows of decorated officers, past the President of the United States standing beside me. I focused entirely on the massive television camera mounted on a tripod at the back of the room. The little red light on top of it was glowing. Live. The President stepped forward. He smiled warmly, holding the silver star, a brilliant silver medal suspended from a red, white, and blue ribbon. "Corporal," the President whispered to me, so the microphones wouldn't catch it, "your country is in your debt." He pinned the medal to my chest. The flashes of dozens of cameras erupted like a localized lightning storm, blinding me for a fraction of a second. The room exploded into applause. Mitchell was on his feet, cheering loudly. Wyatt was saluting. But I didn't look at them. I turned slightly and locked my eyes dead center on the lens of the live broadcast camera. I held the gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stared into the lens with a calm, unbreakable resolve. "I know you're watching, Edmund." Hundreds of miles away, in a dusty, dimly lit living room in South Boston, my father was sitting in his worn-out leather recliner. Sullivan told me later exactly what happened. Sullivan had let himself into the house with a spare key and turned the television on, refusing to let Edmund look away. Edmund sat paralyzed. He watched the daughter he called a porcelain doll, the girl he said would embarrass the family name, stand in the White House and receive the third highest military decoration for valor in combat. He saw me stare into the camera, and he knew. In that silent, televised gaze, he knew that his secret was utterly powerless against my reality. I didn't break. He did. The ceremony ended, and the reception began. I shook hands until my fingers were numb. I posed for photos with senators I didn't know and generals who shook my hand with genuine respect. When I finally retreated to a quiet hallway to catch my breath, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. The screen lit up with dozens of congratulatory texts from the guys in my unit. But at the very top of the screen was a notification for a new voicemail. The contact name read, "Dad." My thumb hovered over the screen. My heart hammered in my chest harder than it had during the firefight. I walked into a private alcove, pressed the phone to my ear, and hit play. First, there was only static, accompanied by the sound of heavy, ragged breathing. I thought he was going to hang up. I thought his pride would win, just like it always did. Then, a voice broke through the speaker. It was thick, trembling, and completely stripped of the artificial bravado I had known my entire life. "Cassidy!" Edmund's voice cracked. He sounded incredibly old. He sounded broken. He paused for a long time. I could hear the faint sound of the television still playing in the background of his living room. "I was wrong," he whispered. The words sounded like they were physically tearing his throat apart. I was so goddamn wrong. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The line went dead. I stood in the hallway of the White House, the heavy metal of the silver star pressing against my chest. The anger that had fueled me for years, the burning desire to prove him wrong, to shove his words down his throat, suddenly evaporated. It wasn't replaced by forgiveness. Not yet. Too much damage had been done for a single voicemail to fix. But it was replaced by peace. The war with my father was finally over. I had built myself into a weapon to fight his ghosts, only to realize I was strong enough to conquer my own. I lowered the phone, took a deep breath, and walked back out into the light. If you've ever been told you aren't strong enough, aren't tough enough, or that you're destined to fail by the people who should be supporting you, this story is for you. True strength doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from standing your ground when the fire gets hot. If Cassidy's journey inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more incredible real-life stories. Stay strong,